All right. We were yesterday doing a brief recapitulation of the life of Thomas Aquinas. I want to wrap that up quickly and then get into his thought. I'd like to be done with Thomas Aquinas by Christmas, which is going to be a Herculean task, but we'll at least take a run at it. I'd like to be able to then, come back neatly with the Renaissance after the break. But Thomas Aquinas is such a delightful character that I really can't feel good about treating him unless we at least cover some of this. So we looked at some of the little anecdotes that are connected with him. There's another one that comes from Reginald I thought might be of interest to you. He was, when Thomas was traveling one day with his monk brothers, who were always with him, by the way. He was so absent-minded that he had a little cadre of 4 or 5 monks, and their only task was to just kind of herd, shepherd Thomas from here to there, because he would get lost. He reminded me of my son, Brent, who has children here, by the way, but whenever we went to on little excursions, like we went to Disneyland once, he was probably 5 years old and the other kids were there, and they would all sort of march along from one place to the next. Okay, let's go do this ride. And he would always just we'd always count heads, and one was missing, and it was invariably Brent. And we'd go looking, where's Brent? And he didn't even know he was lost. He'd just be wandering off, kind of, this little head bobbing along. It's kind of the way Thomas was, except that he stood about 6 feet tall and weighed 400 pounds. Otherwise, so it was easier to find him in a crowd. That was a good thing there. He was a little bit more conspicuous. But in any event, there's a story of when he was on a little trip walking through Paris, and they were looking at the sights, and one of his monkish brothers commented to him in passing that, wow, isn't this a beautiful city? It's just great, isn't it? And Thomas reputedly responded to him, quote, "In truth, at this moment, I would prefer to have the homilies of Chrysostom on Matthew," which may or may not grab you, but it's so typical of him. He was a theologian. He didn't care about sightseeing. He didn't care about frivolity. He didn't care about, just kind of levity, having a good time. He just wanted to be in the books, reading, studying, working. And he was more or less relentless in his pursuit of truth. He was also a quite humble guy. There's another story that even when Thomas was very famous and was well known, he never would permit himself to be dressed in anything other than the simple monk's garment, kind of this. It looks like sort of a, brown, just, what I'm saying. And he would, there was one occasion when there was this junior grade monk who was visiting from a different monastery. And the superior in this monastery had told this would be like a buck private in terms of, military comparisons. Go to town, get some, groceries, basically. And grab one of the other monks and take him along. And so this junior grade monk, who'd never met Thomas Aquinas, didn't know him from anybody, is walking down the hall looking for the first person he can grab, because he's kind of puffed up, he's got some authority, he's got to go to town, get some groceries. And the first guy he happens to bump into is Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous theologians in the world, at that point. And he barks at this guy, "Hey, you monk, come with me." Thomas never says a word. This would be like some, junior high kid ordering Einstein to come with him on some, little errand or something. And Thomas Aquinas is just fully humble. He follows him, goes to town, wastes about half the day, to help get groceries. The monk was almost fired when they got back and found out what he had done. He was chagrined beyond all description, but Thomas never said a word. Thomas was brilliant, obviously. He was one of those people, sometimes you see people that can play 21 games of chess at the same time. You ever seen that phenomenon? Like you have 21 chess players in a circle and one guy who just goes around. There was actually one guy who could do that blindfolded. He could play 21 separate games of chess blindfolded. and win. He could remember every game. I mean, well, Thomas was a little bit like that. I mean, he was a flaming genius. Only in his case, it was a genius of theology. And what Thomas would do is, because it was too slow to write himself, he could write, but it became too inefficient, he would dictate. And the people that took dictation from him learned to do it in a kind of shorthand, because he would dictate so rapidly that you couldn't just write it down longhand. You had to kind of do it like a court reporter, you know. But even that was too slow, and so Thomas is one of those rare people who could dictate to 4 or 5 different people simultaneously. And he did it in just kind of rapid succession. So if you were my people, I'd give you a sentence, and then back to you, you see. And then by the time I get back to you, you've just barely finished the last one. 4 separate topics, you know, completely unrelated subjects, and he could dictate like that. I mean, you know, there are people like that in the world. Not many. But Thomas was one of them. And so this stuff that he would publish many times came not with long reflection, you know, but just kind of this rapid fire mind he had. So that's the kind of guy he was. We should all be proud of him as a Christian personality. You know, he's one of the great treasures of the church, not just the Catholic Church, but of the church itself. And so I hope that if you have opportunities in the future to be engaged in study of Thomas, that you'll seize that opportunity. All right. The single most important theme, topic, generally associated with Thomas Aquinas is called the classical synthesis. And I'd like to get us going on what that is. The classical synthesis. By the way, I meant to mention, this is an interesting little feature of Thomas back on the biography. Sorry, I messed up your notes here, but his death is very interesting. He, about 3 weeks before he died, he was in perfect health, apparently. He's 49 years old, young guy, looked like he had years of productive labor in front of him. He was celebrating the Mass one day. That is, he was in a service celebrating the Mass. And right in the middle of it, he had what, nobody knows for sure what happened. Some people thought it was a stroke, but something happened. And he just kind of froze, was paralyzed. He didn't fall down, but he was just kind of like a kind of stunned experience. And they had to actually lead him out. You know, he became whatever, just not functional. And he didn't say anything. He stopped his writing. He stopped his dictating, stopped his studies. He just stopped at 49 years and became almost like someone in a daze. And as the story goes, he was asked repeatedly, what's wrong? And he just wouldn't answer until finally his closest friend, who was actually his biographer, the guy who gives us this information, a guy named Reginald, took Thomas aside, sat down, asked him, you know, looked in his eyes and tried to force the issue. What is wrong, Thomas? What's wrong? Help us here. And Thomas reportedly responded, Reginald, I have seen such things that it makes everything that I've written up to this point seem like so much straw. It's a very famous quote from Thomas Aquinas. The last thing he ever said, basically. So, you know, the best guess is that it's sort of like the Apostle Paul or something. It was, you know, I mean, that's the way it's construed. He just had some kind of vision that so exceeded even his insight that it made him feel like all that he had said up to that point was just useless trivia. You know. Now, if the best things he had said up to that point were useless trivia, I don't know where that leaves the rest of us. I really don't. We're like in kindergarten playing with blocks here a little bit. But there are these spirits in the history of the church that have that kind of insight and genius. And for Thomas, it was life-changing, and he really stopped at that point. He was traveling about 3 weeks later. He was on a little journey from, you know, point A to point B, and he collapsed. And he happened to collapse not far from a Benedictine monastery, interestingly. And so they They hauled him into this Benedictine. Of course, he's a world famous, probably the most famous guy in the Christian world, certainly. They hauled him into this Benedictine monastery, which is incredibly honored to have Thomas, even in his broken health there. He was there for about 2 days, and then he died. And so he died at a very young age and rather unexpectedly. And those were the circumstances of it, so interesting. All right, classical synthesis. I want you to, as best you can, get a hold of this. This is probably the heart of the matter with respect to Thomas. I'm going to give you a quote. I'd like you to take it down. It'll push the limits of a flabby brain exercise, but let's try it that way. Then I'll give it to you, okay? It's about 4 lines. So here we go. The truth of the Christian faith surpasses capacity of reason. Nevertheless, that truth, that the human reason is naturally endowed to know, cannot be opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. Y'all got it? One more time from the top, just to check. The truth of the Christian faith surpasses the capacity of reason, semicolon. Nevertheless, that truth, that the human reason is naturally endowed to know, cannot be opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. I will at some point or other ask you to explain why that quote represents an attack on the principles of double truths and equipollens. So as I'm talking about this, I want you to be listening for that information, because that's what you should be sort of digesting and prepared to discuss. All right, in the Middle Ages, there had come to be a kind of classical, common, widely recognized distinction between what was then called grace and nature. It is roughly the same, but not quite the same, as Plato's distinction between the ideal and the receptacle. But it's that concept. Grace is the world of revelation. This is from a Christian point of view. The world of revelation, God's revealed truth. It's that of faith. And it's that of metaphysics. So it's revelation, faith, metaphysics. Ultimate truth, ultimate reality, including that which we would not know if God did not reveal it to us. Transcendent truth. The world of nature was the world of perception, science, observation. The world of empirical study. So there's the basic difference. Now obviously, this is, first of all, this is not anything Aquinas came up with. This was already the common view. This, of course, represents a kind of Platonic outlook. You could go back to Augustine to find, generally this understanding. So we all have this, hopefully we all have a working idea of this in our heads without being too technical or sophisticated about it. We all know that there are things that we cannot directly see. Nevertheless, we organize our life by these things all the time. The other day I was talking to you about justice. We all have a strong sense of justice. It's one of the earliest discoveries a child makes when they utter that profound ethical assessment of a circumstance in life at about 2 years old, crying out what? not fair. Right? None of you ever did that, of course. I'm sure. Where does that come from? Here's a child. You know, they learn to say mama, dada, not fair. It's like, you don't have to teach a kid that. It's not some kind of schooling. Okay, we're going to go to the school of fairness. You're going to learn about, it's just, it's there. It's just, what is that? Well, we all have it. I was in a huge conflict. Well, not that huge, but, and this is just between us, you understand. Keep it in here. With the 10th graders. Over the nature of a simile. One of those burning issues, the whole universe sort of hangs on this, And I had dinged some of the kids in the class a point or two because they had failed to give a precise expression of a simile. And they were arguing with some degree of heat that the use of simile that they were basing their answer on was what they learned in the 3rd grade. In the grammar, Shirley grammar, whatever that is. And they were just up in arms. I was amazed at the fury in the room because we had a little difference over the nature of a simile, that was costing them maybe a point or so on the test. Now, I don't want you to go and tell the 10th graders that Mr. Gore is still licking his wounds from having been beaten up by the 10th graders. Please don't do that. It all came out nicely. We all got together and prayed and had a nice little confession. Everything's okay. That's fine. But it just is amazing to me. We don't have to dig too deep or go too far to hit that feeling of justice, right? How important is it to us on the one hand, and yet have you ever actually seen it? Can you go out and put justice in a test tube? Can you centrifuge it? Can you weigh it? Can you measure it? It is a completely immaterial and yet absolutely essential part of our human experience, isn't it? And that's just one item, let alone things like love, beauty, all of these things that life would be vanilla, bland, meaningless, and pointless if it weren't for these deep things, none of which we can see directly. That's the distinction. There is that which is upstairs. And yet, though we never see it, we are constantly operating on the assumption that those things are there, and that's how we make sense out of what's down here. Now, these are things we've been over before. I'm not telling you anything new, I hope, right now. This is what's basically going on with this distinction between grace and nature. That the things upstairs, except in this case, it also includes Christian truth. It would include things about God's workings in the world and so on that we wouldn't discover simply by scientific means. All right. So that's the basic idea. Now, at the time of the late Middle Ages, or at least the time of Thomas Aquinas, there were essentially 2 or 3 different ways in which the relationship between those worlds was viewed. Okay, so one relationship would be one of basically hostility. That these 2 worlds are, in a sense, in a dualism. That Christian truth on the one hand is, in a sense, at war with natural truth on the other. Another view was that the only world that matters is the world upstairs, and that anything down here, really, we don't care about it anywho. So rather than describing it as a kind of dualism, it was a view of simply discounting the natural world. This would be a true Platonic influence. And you'd have to say that was something of Augustine's influence. The real focus, the real concern of your academic pursuit is to understand what's up here. And what's down here, well, who cares? People like Dijkstra care about it, but really, come on. Who cares about science and so on? I'm speaking, you understand, facetiously. You're not going to run and tell Mr. Dijkstra that I discounted the importance of science. But you understand the sense there. Nobody was really running around with a straight face at the time of Thomas Aquinas arguing this point, that there is a connection, in fact there is a kind of seamless continuity between the one and the other, you see. And it's that quest to try to find a connection between them, so it's all one great world of truth. That's called the classical synthesis. It's the question, can we synthesize the transcendent world on the one hand with this empirical world of nature on the other? The prevailing attitude at the time of Thomas Aquinas was something like this. Here's what Christians believe up here. Here's what naturalists, paren the Islamic world, to some degree the Jewish world, skeptical spirits generally, believe on the other, and they are attacking. So you've got kind of science in an attack mode, attacking what Christians believe. And Christians, in a sense, were getting into what you might call a fortress mentality. Meaning, instead of going out and fighting this battle, they were simply saying, well, hey, the things we believe are simply things we believe by faith. And we're going to put it all in a safe place where science cannot attack it. It's just faith. Well, how do you attack faith? You just believe it. And if you can put your faith in a safe place, kind of this hermetically sealed chamber where science cannot attack it, then you're safe. There's obviously nothing you can say to the scientific world, but you just say, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to fight that battle. I'm not going to try to engage in a conflict of ideas between my Christian truth and what the secular world is saying on the other hand. I'm just going to get inside my monastery and I'm going to pray and read my Bible and I'm going to believe these things and I don't care what those scientists are saying. That's called a fortress mentality. You follow that? There's a whole lot of that out there in the world you're living in right now. And that was kind of what was happening. As it seemed that the naturalistic attitudes of the time were attacking Christian truth, Christians were sort of holding up inside this safe place. But some of them were wondering, I wonder who's really getting the right answers here. And that's what ideas like double truths and equipollents were all about. Especially double truths. Well, I can hold this truth to be true here, even though maybe something else is true here. This kind of remarkable, just totally inconsistent idea. I can believe in special creation up here, but down here I'm an evolutionist. Would be the way you'd hear it today. You kind of follow that? And that's what's going on. Well, Thomas Aquinas shows up, and his quest, his plan, is to destroy that. He wants to not only not have a wall here, he doesn't even want to really have a solid line there. He wants to blow some holes through that so that we begin to see that all of this truth is consistent with itself. That the truth of nature is fully consistent with the truth of grace. All right? And that's a synthesis. How does he do that? He does it by introducing what I like to call the mezzanine level. This, by the way, is not a term you will hear if you study Aquinas. Sometimes I give you my little pet terms, and I try to remember to tell you that. So you won't hear any PhD in philosophy someday talk about the mezzanine level in Thomas Aquinas' Outlook, unless he stole it from me, which is possible, but I doubt it. All right, the mezzanine level works like this. If you can imagine a kind of third level here. You know what a mezzanine is? You go to the... You don't know what a mezzanine is. What's a mezzanine? Oh, you don't know what a mezzanine is. What's a mezzanine, Jacob?
It's like... This is kind of difficult to explain. Well, it's like in a building, you have the bottom floor, it's at street level.
Right.
But then you'll have kind of a half floor, so that will kind of be like in the entrance area. that's technically the second floor, but it's called mezzanine.
That's right. Yeah, the best example that comes to mind is the, I don't know what it is now. Is it Macy's? I guess it is now. It used to be the Bon Marché downtown. You been in there lately? Anybody? Christmas time, you should go down to the... You walk in there, and there's an escalator that takes you up, kind of like a half floor. And then you can look over the balcony and you can see all the people down there shopping, or you can take the escalator up to the true second floor. That's called a mezzanine. Now with me? Got that, Avery? That is a mezzanine. All right? Now, this is what I want you to, in a sense, what it means is, according to Thomas, you've got, you might say, 3 levels. So that this line, instead of being one level that separates these two, there's a sense in which you could say there is the same level up here, we'll call it grace. The same level down here, we'll call it nature. And then in between is an overlapping section where these two worlds, grace and nature, overlap with each other. And he calls this overlapping section the articulus mixtus. Okay, the articulus mixtus, which, if you translate that roughly into English, Laura, would mean what? The articulus mixtus would simply be...
I guess something about articulation.
Oh, could be. Okay. Yeah, not quite, but that's a good thought. The articulus mixtus, anybody? Kaylee?
I was thinking to articulate is usually articulate thoughts, so it's kind of like a mixture of thoughts.
No, it is, but it's don't think about articulate here. The root of it would just be like articles. Right? So what are you saying? What is it over there? Say it. Somebody? Whoever. You guys are high-fiving each other. I figure somebody must have got the right answer. Say it.
Well, I said mixture of articles.
Okay, that's it. Okay. Mixed articles. Mixed articles. And what he means by that is these are articles of truth. These are propositions of truth that, in a sense, lie both on the side of grace and on the side of nature. They're in the mezzanine level, and in a sense, they stand in both worlds. And even though it's a bit awkward to stop this fascinating conversation at this point, I nevertheless must do so because of the tyranny of the clock. So, see ya.